A movement begins with preaching, hope, memory, and expectation. Centuries later, it has councils, creeds, bishops, courts, laws, rituals, borders, punishments, and political alliances strong enough to shape empires. Spinoza looked at that transformation and saw the machinery most believers were never taught to see. Religion did not merely comfort the human soul. In the hands of power, it could organize obedience more deeply than any army. There is a question that most people raised inside Christianity were never invited to ask. Not a question about whether God exists, not a question about the sincerity of believers, not even a question about the content of Scripture. The question is simpler and in many ways more dangerous than any of those. How did a movement that began with 12 disciples in an occupied province of the Roman Empire become one of the most powerful institutional forces in the history of human civilization? How did a message about inward transformation, forgiveness, and love become the ideological architecture of empires, the engine of courts that burned heretics, the foundation of laws that governed entire populations for over 1,000 years? That is the question that Spinoza would not let go of. And when you follow that question long enough, when you trace the path from the earliest communities of followers to the councils that decided what Christians were required to believe, from the voluntary gatherings of the persecuted to the mandatory confessions of the conquered, something begins to appear in the background of every sacred text and every solemn creed, something that was never announced, never preached from the pulpit, never placed in the catechism. Call it the machinery, the set of structures, incentives, powers, and fears that turned a spiritual movement into a political institution. What you are about to examine is not a sermon and not a theology course. It is an investigation. And the investigator whose lens we will use saw things about religion and power that his own century could barely survive hearing. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632. Into a Jewish community of families who had fled the persecution of the Iberian Inquisition. He was educated in scripture, in philosophy, and in the long tradition of religious commentary. He was, by every outward measure, a man formed inside religious community. And then in 1656, the community that raised him issued against him one of the most severe acts of excommunication in recorded Jewish history. The document called him a man of abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, and it forbade every member of the community from reading his words, speaking to him, or living under the same roof. He was 23 years old. Whatever he had already begun to think was dangerous enough that those who knew him best could not afford to tolerate it. What Spinoza had begun to see was a pattern, not a conspiracy, not a cabal, not a secret plot. A pattern. Across religious traditions, across different centuries, across communities that claimed entirely different revelations and entirely different gods, the same structure kept appearing. Religious authorities claimed access to divine truth. That claim produced obedience in the population. That obedience produced social order. That social order was enormously useful to those who held authority over it. And once a religious institution understood how useful that obedience was, The protection of doctrine became inseparable from the protection of power. Spinoza's most politically explosive work, the theological political treatise published in 1670, laid out this analysis with a precision that terrified European governments enough that they banned it almost immediately. His lens did not require cynicism about every believer. It required honesty about every institution, and that distinction is where the investigation begins. The story that most people raised inside Christianity received was not presented as a political story. It was presented as a story of rescue. The world had fallen into a condition of separation from God, a condition called sin, and humanity could not repair that separation by its own effort or merit. Into that broken world, God sent His own Son, Jesus of Nazareth, born of a virgin, filled with divine authority, who lived among the poor, healed the sick, challenged the proud, and was ultimately executed by the political and religious powers of his time. 3 days after his death, the story continued. He rose from the dead, demonstrating that death itself had been defeated. Before returning to the divine realm, he instructed his followers to carry this message of salvation to every nation. The church that emerged from that instruction was not merely a human organization. It was, the tradition insisted, the body of Christ on earth, the vessel of His continuing presence, the custodian of eternal truth. This is the story that was taught to children in Sunday schools, rehearsed in baptismal ceremonies, inscribed in catechisms, and repeated in the liturgies of communities across every inhabited continent. It was not merely a theological claim. It was a complete account of reality, of why the world is broken, of where humanity came from, of what humanity needs most desperately, and of what happens when a human life ends. Every element of the story was presented as revealed rather than constructed, as divine rather than historical, as eternal rather than political. To believe it was salvation. To doubt it was, depending on the era and the institution, heresy, sin, or damnation. The content of that story carried with it an entire moral architecture. Because Jesus had loved enemies, believers were called to love enemies. Because Jesus had served the poor, the church was called to serve the poor. Because Jesus had spoken truth to power and been killed for it, believers were called to courage and witness. The ethical vision embedded in the founding story was, by any serious measure, a remarkable thing. It oriented entire communities toward forgiveness, toward humility, toward the dignity of the suffering. The tradition produced hospitals, orphanages, schools, libraries, and acts of extraordinary charity. None of this was invented. None of this was accidental. And none of this, a careful investigator must insist, is what the critique is about. The critique is about something that grew alongside all of this, and sometimes consumed it. Ask someone who was deeply shaped by Christian faith why the tradition felt sacred to them, and the answers arrive quickly and from the most personal parts of memory. It was the smell of candles in a dark sanctuary. It was the voice of a grandmother praying over a sick child. It was the feeling nearly impossible to describe. of participating in a ritual so ancient that the same words had been spoken by human beings across 40 generations. Sacred traditions do not feel sacred because theologians have made coherent arguments. They feel sacred because they are woven into the fabric of what a person understood love to mean when they were young, and the world was still being explained to them. The sense of sacred community produced by Christian practice was not trivial. In towns and cities across centuries, the church was the only institution that gathered people across family lines, across economic distinctions, to some degree across the different seasons of a human life. You were baptized in the church, married in the church, buried from the church. The community that gathered around those moments offered something that no merely political institution could easily replicate: a sense that your individual life mattered within a story larger than yourself, that your suffering had meaning, that your death was not the end of your significance. This is not manipulation in its origin. This is one of the deepest things human beings have ever done for one another. Scripture itself carried a weight that went beyond argument. For believers who encountered the Psalms in moments of grief, the words did not feel like ancient political documents. They felt like someone who had been exactly where they were and had survived the darkness. For believers who read the Sermon on the Mount, the instructions to love enemies and seek peace did not feel like institutional programming. They felt like the most demanding and most beautiful ethical call they had ever heard. The power of sacred text is not simply the power of authority. It is the power of language that arrives at the right moment and names something that the reader had not been able to name for themselves. This is why people do not surrender sacred traditions easily, not because they are incapable of thought, because the tradition gave them a language for their deepest experiences, and leaving it feels like losing a part of the vocabulary of being alive. The crack does not appear immediately. It appears when you notice the gap between the story a tradition tells about itself and the history that the tradition actually produced. Christianity taught humility and produced hierarchies. It taught service and produced princes of the church. It taught the love of enemies and organized crusades. It taught that the truth would set people free and then established institutions with the authority to define what truth was and to punish those who arrived at different conclusions. None of this is secret. It is all documented in historical records that the tradition itself preserved. But for a person raised inside the faith, these contradictions are usually explained away before they can be examined. The Crusades were a tragic distortion. The Inquisitions were a regrettable excess. The corruption of certain popes was an aberration, not a pattern. The individual sins of men, not the logic of the institution. What Spinoza would ask is a harder question. What if the distortions were not accidental? What if the pattern itself reveals something about what religious institutions necessarily become when they acquire enough power? What if the gap between the founding story of love and humility and the historical record of authority and control is not a series of individual failures but a structural consequence of turning a spiritual movement into an institution that controls the meaning of truth. This is not a comfortable question. It does not allow easy answers, and it requires the viewer to hold two things at once: genuine respect for the sincerity of private faith and genuine honesty about what institutions do with the authority that faith provides. This is the first real rupture in the inherited story, and it is the rupture that every serious investigation of religious history must eventually confront. Not the question of whether Jesus existed, not the question of whether miracles are possible, but the quieter and more corrosive question of what happens to a spiritual message once an institution decides that it is responsible for protecting it. If this question has lived in you without permission, if you have felt it rising and then pushed it down because asking it felt disloyal or dangerous, then you understand already why this investigation matters. And if you find that this kind of honest examination is something you want more of, take a moment to show your support by liking this video. It is how this kind of work continues to reach the people who need it most. To understand how Christianity became a political machine, you have to stand in the 1st and 2nd centuries and understand what it actually was before it became powerful. The earliest communities of followers of Jesus were not institutions, they were networks. Small gatherings in private homes, mostly in cities across the eastern Mediterranean, composed largely of people from the lower and middle sections of Roman society. Merchants, freed persons, artisans, women whose legal status under Roman law gave them very little public authority. These communities practiced a form of mutual aid that was genuinely countercultural. They shared resources. They claimed that social distinctions of status and ethnicity meant less inside the community than they did outside it. The Apostle Paul, writing in the mid-1st century, captured this with a phrase that was, in its original context, genuinely radical. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female. Whether this vision was consistently realized is a separate question, but the aspiration itself was a genuine disruption of the hierarchical logic of Roman society. For roughly 2.5 centuries, these communities existed in a complicated relationship with Roman imperial power. There were periods of intense persecution, when to be identified as a Christian could mean execution in spectacles designed to demonstrate Roman authority. There were longer periods of relative tolerance, during which the communities grew, developed leadership structures, produced theological literature, and began to resolve internal disputes about what exactly it meant to be a follower of Jesus. The diversity of these early communities is something that is easy to underestimate. There was not a single early Christianity. There were many early Christianities with different texts, different practices, different understandings of who Jesus was and what his life and death meant. This diversity would become a problem the moment the tradition encountered centralized power, because centralized power requires unified doctrine. The decisive historical turning point arrived in the 4th century with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. Whether Constantine's conversion was genuine in its spiritual dimensions is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is what followed it. In 313, the Edict of Milan granted Christians full legal toleration across the empire. Within decades, Christianity moved from being one of many tolerated religious movements to being the officially favored religion of the most powerful empire in the Western world. The Church gained the right to own property. Clergy gained legal privileges. The emperor himself began to involve himself in theological disputes because theological unity had become a matter of imperial interest. A fractured church was a potential source of political instability. A unified church was a potential instrument of imperial cohesion. The First Great Council of the Church, held at Nicaea in 325, was convened by Constantine himself. The bishops who attended did not arrive as persecuted servants of a spiritual movement. They arrived as guests of the emperor, transported at imperial expense, housed in imperial accommodations, deliberating under the watchful interest of imperial power. The question they were resolving, whether Jesus was of the same substance as God or of similar substance, was a genuine theological dispute with deep roots in the tradition. But it was also, from the perspective of imperial politics, a question that needed a definitive answer. Ambiguity about the nature of the central figure of the empire's religion was a kind of instability that power could not easily afford. The council produced a creed. The creed was not merely a statement of faith, it was a boundary. To be inside it was to be orthodox, to be outside it was to be a heretic. And to be a heretic increasingly was to be not just theologically wrong, but legally vulnerable. By the end of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity was not merely favored by the empire, it was the official state religion, and the practice of traditional Roman religion was banned. The movement that had begun with 12 frightened people in an upper room in Jerusalem had, in roughly 3.5 centuries, become the ideological foundation of the largest political structure in the Western world. The architecture of that movement had changed entirely. It now had a hierarchy of bishops organized into a structure that mirrored Roman administrative geography. It had councils with the authority to define truth. It had the coercive power of the state available to enforce that truth against dissenters. The original communities of the persecuted had become the institution of the powerful. That transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because specific people with specific interests found in Christianity something enormously useful. The Roman emperors who embraced and promoted Christianity after Constantine did not do so in a theological vacuum. They did so in the context of an empire that was under serious strain. The 3rd century had been a period of near-continuous civil war, economic instability, and military crisis. The empire had survived, but its social cohesion was fragile. What a universal religion offered, if it could be made truly universal, was something that neither military force alone nor political ideology alone could easily provide: a shared moral universe. a set of stories, values, rituals, and authorities that could give millions of people spread across an enormous geographic area the sense that they belong to the same sacred community. Empire had always required ideology. Christianity, once it could be unified and controlled, offered one of the most powerful ideological tools in human history. The bishops who negotiated with imperial power in the 4th and 5th centuries were not simply passive recipients of imperial favor. They were active participants in the construction of a new kind of authority. The Bishop of Rome, whose claim to special authority over other bishops was itself a matter of dispute within the tradition, began in this period to develop what would eventually become the papacy, a claim to spiritual and eventually political authority that was explicitly superior to the authority of secular rulers in certain domains. This was not merely a spiritual argument, it was a political one. The ability to determine who was and who was not in communion with the Church, to excommunicate rulers, to declare wars just or unjust, to control the rituals through which people entered and left respectable society. This was power of an extraordinary kind, and those who held it had every incentive to protect the theological claims that justified their holding it. Local clergy across the empire occupied a position that was unprecedented in the ancient world. The priest or bishop was the person who controlled access to sacraments that were understood to be necessary for eternal salvation. Baptism removed the stain of original sin. Confession and absolution restored a soul that had fallen after baptism. The Eucharist maintained the spiritual life of the community. Extreme unction prepared the soul for death. Without the clergy, a believer had no authorized access to any of these rituals. This gave the clergy a kind of power over the population that went far beyond anything a secular administrator could claim. A tax collector could threaten a peasant with legal punishment. A priest could threaten a peasant with damnation. These were not equivalent threats. One affected this life. The other, in the framework of the tradition, affected everything beyond it. The medieval nobility, when it eventually emerged as a dominant force in Western European political life, found in the Church a partner with whom it had a complicated but mutually reinforcing relationship. The Church legitimized noble rule by framing it within a divine order. Kings were anointed with sacred oil in ceremonies administered by bishops. To rebel against a legitimately constituted Christian ruler was not merely political treason. It could be framed as a sin against the order that God had established. In return, the nobility protected the Church's property, enforced its laws against heretics and dissenters, and provided the military force that the Church itself could not directly wield. This arrangement was not a conspiracy between secret elites. It was simply what happens when two institutions with different kinds of power discover that they are more effective together than they are separately. The monasteries and religious orders that developed throughout the medieval period added another layer to this structure of power and benefit. Monasteries were economic actors of enormous significance. They controlled vast land holdings. They managed agricultural production, They preserved and reproduced manuscripts, making themselves indispensable to the intellectual life of a largely illiterate population. They trained administrators, scribes, and scholars who then staffed the governmental apparatus of secular rulers. The church was not merely a spiritual organization that happened to have economic interests. It was an economic and political organization that happened to speak the language of the sacred. The two dimensions were inseparable. And understanding that inseparability is what makes Spinoza's analysis of the relationship between religion and power so difficult to dismiss. The contradiction at the center of institutional Christianity was never fully resolved, because it could not be. The founding story of the tradition was a story about a man who had been rejected by religious authorities, tried by political power, and executed by the state. Whatever theological meanings were layered onto that execution, its basic historical shape was unmistakable. Jesus stood on the side of the marginalized, challenged the institutional religion of his time, and was destroyed by a collaboration of religious and political authority. This was the story that the church proclaimed, and simultaneously the church became one of the most powerful religious and political institutions in human history. With its own courts, its own laws, its own mechanisms of social control, and its own apparatus for suppressing those who challenged its authority. This is not a peripheral irony. It is a structural contradiction that sits at the heart of Christian history. The tradition that told the story of a man killed by institutional power became an institution that exercised similar kinds of power. The community that had once memorized the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers," organized crusades, staffed inquisitions, and crowned emperors. There were always voices within the tradition who pointed to this contradiction. The great reform movements of Christian history, from the monastic movements of the early medieval period to the protests of figures like Francis of Assisi, from the various pre-Reformation dissenting movements to the Protestant Reformation itself, were in large part expressions of anguish at the gap between the founding story and the institutional reality. These reform movements kept appearing because the contradiction kept reasserting itself. The management of that contradiction required an enormous amount of intellectual and rhetorical work. Every generation of theologians and church authorities had to find ways to explain why an institution that wielded coercive power, controlled economic resources, and enforced ideological conformity was genuinely the continuation of a movement that had begun with fishermen and tax collectors gathering voluntarily around a wandering preacher. The explanations were ingenious and varied. Divine providence had arranged the church's rise to power. The coercive elements were regrettable necessities in a fallen world. The institution, whatever its human imperfections, remained the vessel of divine grace. The authority of the clergy, however corruptly exercised by individuals, derived from an unbroken chain of ordination that reached back to the apostles themselves. These were not arguments made in bad faith by every person who made them. Many of the greatest theologians of the tradition genuinely believed what they wrote, but the arguments always served the same function. They made the institution's power look like a theological necessity rather than a historical accident. What Spinoza noticed, and what the historical record makes difficult to deny, is that the most intellectually elaborate theological justifications for institutional authority tended to appear precisely when that authority was being challenged. The doctrine of papal infallibility, for example, was not a central feature of early Christian theology. It developed gradually over centuries, and its most rigorous formulations appeared at moments when the authority of the papacy was under political and theological pressure. This pattern of doctrine hardening exactly when power needs defending is not proof that every doctrine is fabricated, but it is a pattern that an honest investigation cannot ignore. Doctrine and power are not strangers to each other. They have been housemates for a very long time. The believers who were formed inside this institutional tradition were not in most cases aware of these contradictions in any systematic way. They were taught the founding story. They were given the rituals. They were told what the rituals meant. They were warned about the consequences of departing from authorized interpretation. They were not invited to read the church councils as political documents, to trace the economic interests of the clergy, to compare the founding story with the institutional history. The investigation of those connections was, in practice, reserved for those with access to education and texts that most of the population could not read and were not encouraged to seek. The architecture of the institution was arranged so that the person inside it experienced the beliefs as personal and sacred, not as political and constructed. That arrangement was not accidental. It was deeply functional. The hidden machinery is not hidden because someone buried it. It is hidden because the experience of faith is genuinely personal, genuinely emotional, genuinely connected to the most important moments in a human life. When you pray for a dying parent, you are not thinking about the Council of Nicaea. When you feel genuine consolation in a ritual, you are not analyzing the political economy of the medieval church. The machinery stays hidden because it operates at a different level from the level where faith is actually lived. Spinoza understood this. His critique was not of the person who prays. It was of the institution that decided what prayer was permitted to mean, who was authorized to lead it, and what would happen to anyone who prayed differently. To understand Spinoza's analysis of religion and power, you have to begin with what he saw as the fundamental mechanism by which religious authority operates. Spinoza argued in the Theological Political Treatise and in his later work, The Ethics, that most human beings navigate the world not primarily through reason but through imagination, emotion, and habit. This was not an insult. It was an observation about the actual conditions of human cognition. The vast majority of people in any society live within frameworks of meaning that they did not construct through independent philosophical reflection. They inherited those frameworks from family, community, tradition, and authority. They experience those frameworks through symbol, ritual, story, and emotion. They maintain loyalty to those frameworks through the social bonds that are woven into them. This is not a pathology. It is simply how human culture works. What Spinoza understood was that this basic feature of human psychology created an extraordinary opportunity for any institution that was skilled enough to control the frameworks of meaning through which people experience their lives. If you can control the stories a population tells about the origin of the world and the destiny of the soul, if you can control the rituals through which people mark the most important moments of their existence, if you can control the vocabulary through which people understand concepts like sin, righteousness, salvation, and damnation, then you have access to a kind of power that operates below the level of conscious political choice. You are not merely giving people commands. You are shaping the interior landscape from which they generate their own desires, fears, choices, and obediences. Spinoza identified fear and hope as the twin engines through which religious authority achieves this deep level of influence. His analysis in the preface to the theological political treatise begins with a blunt observation. Superstition arises from fear when human beings are uncertain and afraid, when they cannot predict the future or control the forces that threaten them. They become vulnerable to any authority that claims to know what those forces mean and what can be done to appease them. A tradition that can narrate the cause of suffering, that can offer rituals for managing divine anger, that can promise a path from danger to safety, gains an authority over anxious people that is disproportionate to any actual evidence for its claims. And once that authority is established, once the rituals and the stories and the vocabulary are in place, the fear becomes self-maintaining. People fear divine punishment not only for specific sins but for questioning the framework within which sin is defined. The doubt itself becomes the transgression. This is not merely ancient history. Spinoza was writing in the 17th century about a structure he could observe operating around him in real time. He lived in a Europe where religious authority still determined what books could be published, what ideas could be taught in universities, what political positions could be held by members of minority religious communities, and what could happen to someone who publicly questioned authorized doctrine. He was not theorizing about a distant danger. He was anatomizing the air he breathed. And his analysis was particularly dangerous because it did not attack the content of religious belief primarily. It attacked the mechanism by which belief becomes authority. That mechanism, he argued, operates in exactly the same way whether the doctrine being enforced is true or false. The machinery of religious control does not depend on the truth of the doctrine it controls. It depends on the fear of questioning it. Spinoza's account of how religious language works is especially important for understanding the relationship between theology and political power. He argued that the prophets and authors of sacred texts communicated in the language of imagination and emotion, not in the language of philosophical reason. This was not a deficiency. For their time and their audience, it was an appropriate and powerful mode of communication. But what happens when the imaginative language of prophetic texts becomes the legally enforced ideology of an empire? What happens when a metaphor becomes a creed? when a story becomes a law, when a vision becomes a definition of truth that carries criminal penalties for those who understand it differently. Spinoza's answer was that something essential is corrupted in that transformation. The imaginative communication of a prophet, which was addressed to a specific people in a specific historical moment, is frozen into a universal doctrinal formula that serves the needs of an institution rather than the spiritual lives of the people inside it. The distinction Spinoza drew between theology and philosophy was one of the most subversive elements of his analysis. Theology, he argued, could not claim rational authority. Its texts were not demonstrations. They were narratives, visions, exhortations, and laws addressed to particular historical communities. Philosophy, by contrast, operated through universal reason and was not bound by the authority of any text or any institution. When religious authorities claimed that theology and philosophy must be harmonized, and that where they diverge, philosophy must yield to theology, they were making a claim that Spinoza found both intellectually dishonest and politically revealing. The claim was not primarily a claim about truth. It was a claim about authority. It was a way of ensuring that the institutional guardians of theological interpretation retained the power to define reality against the independent investigations of reason. And it was a claim that Spinoza, at considerable personal risk, refused to accept. Apply Spinoza's lens to the actual institutional evolution of Christianity, and the analysis becomes uncomfortably precise. Consider the development of clerical authority. In the earliest layers of Christian communities, leadership was relatively fluid. Different communities had different structures. There were apostles, prophets, teachers, deacons, overseers. Authority was often charismatic rather than institutional, meaning it derived from perceived spiritual gifts rather than from formal office. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as the communities grew and the diversity of theological opinion became more difficult to manage, a clearer hierarchical structure began to emerge. The single bishop as the authoritative head of a local community, with authority over the other leaders, became the dominant model. And the justification for this increasing concentration of authority was in every case theological. The bishop was the successor of the apostles. The apostles had received their authority from Jesus. Jesus had received his authority from God. Therefore, to question the authority of the bishop was to question the authority of God. Spinoza's analysis of how this kind of argument functions does not require us to say that everyone who made it was consciously cynical. The point is structural rather than personal. Once an institution establishes a theological justification for its authority, the defense of that authority and the defense of the theology become indistinguishable. To question whether the bishop's authority is truly apostolic in origin is not merely a historical question. It is a theological challenge that can be and historically was treated as a spiritual danger. The machinery is elegant precisely because it transforms political questions about authority into spiritual questions about obedience to God. The person who asks who decided that the bishop has this authority has already, by asking, placed themselves in a position of spiritual risk. The question itself is evidence of their problem. The great doctrinal councils of the early and medieval church can be read through Spinoza's lens with similar clarity. The Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The various medieval councils that defined the sacraments, the authority of the papacy, the nature of the Eucharist. These gatherings were theological deliberations. They were also political events with political consequences. The creeds they produced were not merely spiritual professions, they were boundary documents. They defined who belonged to the community of the faithful and who did not. They had the authority of councils that were increasingly backed by the coercive power of the state. And the specific theological formulations they chose were not always purely the result of disinterested theological reflection. They were also the result of political negotiations, regional rivalries between major episcopal sees, imperial preferences, and the specific theological training of the bishops who had the most influence in the deliberations. The Holy Spirit may have guided the councils, but the bishops also had politics. The doctrine of original sin, as it was developed particularly by Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, provides a particularly instructive example of Spinoza's analysis in action. Augustine's doctrine held that the sin of Adam had corrupted the entire human nature of every person descended from him, producing a condition of fundamental disorder, guilt, and helplessness that no human effort could overcome. Only divine grace distributed through the Church and its sacraments could restore the soul to a condition in which salvation was possible. This was and is a powerful and internally coherent theological vision. It also had certain structural consequences that were enormously convenient for an institution claiming to be the exclusive mediator of divine grace. If every human being enters the world already guilty, already disordered, already incapable of finding their way to God without authorized assistance, then the institution that provides that assistance holds a kind of power over the human condition that is very difficult to challenge. You cannot escape the problem by your own effort. You need the institution. The institution knows this, and Augustine's theology, whatever its genuine spiritual depth, provided that institution with one of its most powerful and lasting justifications. Spinoza's lens also illuminates the institutional use of ritual. The sacraments of the Church were not merely symbolic acts. They were, in the theological framework developed by the institution, efficacious acts. They actually did something to the soul. Baptism actually removed sin. Ordination actually conferred a permanent spiritual character on the priest, making the priest fundamentally different from the layperson. The Eucharist actually transformed the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. These were not metaphors or commemorations. They were, within the authorized framework, supernatural events, and they could only be performed by authorized clergy using authorized forms within authorized institutional contexts. The result was a system in which the entire spiritual economy of the population, their relationship to sin, grace, forgiveness, and eternal destiny, flowed through the hands of a specific class of people whose authority derived from institutional ordination rather than from any observable spiritual quality. Spinoza's question is not whether the sacraments are real. His question is, who benefits from the claim that they can only be administered by an authorized institution? The architecture of confession and absolution deserves particular attention in this analysis. The practice of auricular confession, in which a believer privately recounted their sins to a priest, who then pronounced absolution, developed over centuries into a mandatory institution in Western Christianity, formalized by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The council required annual confession from all Catholic Christians. Consider what this institution created: a systematic, mandatory, regular channel through which the most private information about the beliefs, desires, doubts, and behaviors of the entire population flowed to the clergy. A mechanism for identifying theological deviance, moral nonconformity, and political dissent at the level of individual conscience. A system that made the experience of forgiveness dependent on the judgment of an institutional representative who had the authority to withhold absolution, to assign penance, and to report serious matters to higher ecclesiastical authority. This is, through Spinoza's lens, one of the most sophisticated instruments of social and psychological control ever devised. It did not need to be invented as such. It grew organically from theological premises about the nature of sin, the necessity of contrition, and the authority of the clergy. But its structural function, the regulation of inner life through institutional channels, was precisely what Spinoza's analysis would predict. The most dangerous implication of Spinoza's analysis is not that religion is false. It is something more subtle and more unsettling. It is that the claim of religious authority cannot be evaluated independently of the institutional structure that makes and enforces that claim. When the Church says that this doctrine is the revealed truth of God, that claim is not a neutral statement delivered from outside history. It is a statement made by a specific institution with specific interests in a specific historical moment, using specific mechanisms of authority that have a specific history. The claim cannot be separated from the institution that makes it, and the institution cannot be separated from the power that sustains it. This does not prove the doctrine is false, but it means that the doctrine cannot simply be accepted because the institution is authoritative. The question of who the institution is, how it got its authority, and who benefits from the claim being accepted is always legitimately part of the evaluation. This implication was dangerous enough in Spinoza's time that governments across Europe banned the theological political treatise. It was dangerous because it was not a frontal assault on religious doctrine that could simply be condemned as atheism. It was a structural critique that operated by changing the question. Instead of asking, "Is this doctrine true?" it asked, "How does this doctrine function?" Instead of engaging theological arguments on their own terms, it stepped outside those terms and examined the social and political machinery in which the arguments were embedded. That kind of critique is very difficult to refute from inside the tradition because the tools the tradition offers for refutation are themselves part of the system being analyzed. When a church authority says that Spinoza's critique is wrong because the church has the divinely authorized interpretation of Scripture, they are, from Spinoza's perspective, simply demonstrating his point. The implication extends specifically to the concept of heresy. In the standard theological framework, a heretic is someone who has departed from revealed truth, whose error threatens the spiritual welfare of the community, and whose correction or suppression is therefore a genuine act of mercy or justice. In Spinoza's framework, the concept of heresy functions quite differently. The declaration of heresy is an institutional act that defines the boundary between the acceptable and the unacceptable, the inside and the outside, the safe and the dangerous. That boundary serves the institution's interest in maintaining doctrinal unity, which serves the institution's interest in maintaining authority, which serves the interest of those who hold that authority. The heretic is not primarily a spiritual danger. The heretic is a political one. They represent the possibility that the institution's claim to define reality might be questioned and found unconvincing. That is the actual threat the heresy charge is designed to neutralize. What makes this implication particularly difficult for devout traditions to absorb is that it does not require any particular doctrine to be individually false. Spinoza's analysis would apply equally to a tradition whose core doctrines happen to be correct as to one whose core doctrines were entirely mistaken. The problem is not the content of the doctrine in the first instance. The problem is the social mechanism through which the doctrine is maintained, enforced, and protected from examination. A true doctrine maintained through mechanisms of fear, obedience, and suppression of doubt produces a population that believes it for the wrong reasons. A person who holds a true belief primarily because they fear the consequences of doubting it is not, in any philosophically meaningful sense, a person who understands or has genuinely chosen that belief, and a tradition that relies on fear to maintain its authority has, in doing so, revealed something important about the relationship between the authority and the truth. The dangerous implication for contemporary Christianity is not primarily historical. It is not merely about what happened in the 4th century or the medieval period. It is about the structural logic that continues to operate whenever any religious institution makes the claim that its interpretation of divine truth is authoritative and that doubt or departure from that interpretation carries spiritual consequences. Whenever a preacher tells a congregation that questioning certain doctrines is a sign of spiritual weakness, or that leaving the community will result in divine punishment, or that the authorities of the tradition have access to divine guidance that the individual believer lacks, the machinery Spinoza described is operating. The names have changed. The historical costumes are different. The mechanism is the same. The final dangerous implication is personal rather than political. It is the implication that every person who inherited a religious framework without being invited to examine it has a legitimate right to that examination. not to be herded toward a predetermined conclusion, not to be told that the examination reveals everything is false, but to actually investigate with the full use of their rational and historical faculties the origins, the development, the institutional interests, and the human costs of the beliefs they were given. Spinoza did not offer this right as a gift. He argued for it as something that follows necessarily from the nature of reason itself. No external authority, however ancient, however powerful, however sacred in its self-presentation, has the right to tell a human being that they may not think. That argument got him excommunicated from his community at 23 years old. It also made him one of the most important philosophical voices in the history of Western thought. When a doctrine becomes institutionally useful, it develops a kind of durability that purely spiritual claims rarely achieve on their own. The belief in the divine authority of the Church is a clear example. In purely theological terms, this belief rests on arguments about apostolic succession, scriptural interpretation, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Those arguments have genuine theological depth and have been debated seriously within the tradition for centuries. But the belief also happened to be enormously useful in practical terms. An institution that can successfully claim divine authority for its decisions, its hierarchy, and its doctrines is an institution that can demand a kind of obedience that secular political structures can only approximate. You might disobey a king out of self-interest, but disobeying God through the authorized representatives of God requires a kind of courage that is psychologically very difficult to sustain, especially when the community around you treats that disobedience as spiritual catastrophe. The doctrine of hell served a similar function of institutional utility. As it developed through patristic theology and was codified in the medieval period, the doctrine of hell was not merely a statement about divine justice. It was a social mechanism of extraordinary power. The possibility of eternal torment, vivid in the preaching and the visual art, and the sacred theater of the medieval church, gave the institution's moral and doctrinal authority a backing that no secular government could match. Civil law could punish the body for a finite period. Hell punished the soul forever. In the symbolic economy of a society that took eschatology seriously, this asymmetry was overwhelming. The clergy, who could influence a person's relationship to eternal destiny, held a kind of power over that person's choices, loyalties, and obediences that operated at a far deeper level than the fear of any earthly punishment. The doctrine of legitimate authority, developed most influentially in the Augustinian and later Thomistic traditions, held that existing social hierarchies, including the hierarchies of the Church itself, reflected, however imperfectly, a divinely ordered arrangement. To be in one's proper social place obedient to legitimate authority was not merely politically prudent. It was a spiritual obligation. To rebel against it was not merely politically dangerous. It was a sin against the order that God had established in human society. This theological framing of political obedience was enormously useful to both secular and ecclesiastical rulers, because it gave every challenge to existing authority a spiritual cost. A peasant who resisted unjust taxation was not merely a political actor making a judgment about fairness. In the framework of authorized theology, the peasant was risking the condition of their soul. The machinery of religious meaning transformed a political calculation into a spiritual danger, and in doing so made the existing order far more stable than political force alone could have made it. The concept of sacred identity, the idea that belonging to the Christian community was essential to a person's ultimate spiritual destiny, functioned as perhaps the most pervasive instrument of social cohesion and control in medieval European society. To be excommunicated was not merely to be excluded from religious rituals, it was to be publicly identified as spiritually dangerous, to be cut off from the community of the faithful, to be denied access to the sacraments, and in extreme cases to become a kind of social non-entity. The threat of excommunication was used not only against individual sinners but against rulers. Popes excommunicated emperors and kings, releasing their subjects from the obligation of obedience and transforming political conflicts into spiritual crises. The power of sacred identity was such that even the most powerful secular rulers in European history found themselves vulnerable to it. When Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in 1076, Henry stood barefoot in the snow outside the Pope's castle at Canossa for 3 days seeking absolution. Whatever the complex political calculations involved in that scene, its symbolic force was the direct product of the machinery Spinoza described. The missionary expansion of Christianity, which accelerated dramatically after the European encounter with the Americas and continued through the colonial period, added a global dimension to the political utility of the tradition. Christian mission and European imperial expansion were not always identical, and there were genuine theological and personal motivations behind many individual missionaries that must be distinguished from the imperial project as a whole. But the practical relationship between the two was often intimate. To Christianize a conquered population was, among other things, to give that population a new sacred identity, organized around European ecclesiastical authority, European theological categories, and European institutional structures. It was to replace indigenous frameworks of meaning, which might have sustained resistance with a framework in which the social hierarchy of colonial society could be presented as part of the divinely ordered arrangement of human existence. The useful belief traveled very well across borders. It was one of the most effective technologies of cultural transformation in human history. The psychological landscape that institutional Christianity constructed inside believers was one of the most sophisticated productions in the history of human culture. It began with the doctrine of original sin, which informed every person from earliest consciousness that they had entered the world in a condition of fundamental disorder, not because of anything they had personally done, but because of what their nature was. The effect of this doctrine on the psychology of the believer is difficult to overstate. You began already guilty. You began already in need of rescue. You began already dependent on an authority and a set of rituals that you had not chosen and could not provide for yourself. The doctrine of original sin is, in Spinoza's framework, a masterpiece of psychological preparation for institutional dependence. It creates the need before the institution offers the solution. The experience of religious guilt, as shaped by the tradition's theology and practice, was not a simple emotion. It was a structured psychological experience with specific dimensions, specific triggers, and specific resolutions. The believer was taught to examine their conscience regularly, to identify their failures against an authoritative moral standard, to feel the weight of those failures as an offense against a divine being whose goodness was infinite and whose justice was perfect. The resulting guilt was not merely about having done something wrong, it was about what one fundamentally was: a sinner, a creature whose natural inclinations were disordered, whose reason was corrupted by the fall, whose will was bent toward evil even when it attempted good. This theological anthropology, whatever its spiritual depth, produced a psychological condition in which the individual's own judgment, intuition, and desire were systematically devalued in favor of the judgment of authorized external authority. Your feelings might tell you one thing. The tradition knew better. The promise of salvation functioned as the resolution to the psychological problem that the doctrine of sin had created. And it was a resolution that kept being deferred. You were saved through faith and baptism, but you continued to sin. And continued sin required continued repentance, continued confession, continued penance, continued effort to maintain a state of grace that was always somewhat fragile. The spiritual life, as the institutional tradition structured it, was not a single decisive rescue, but a continuous process of falling, confessing, being restored, and falling again. This structure kept the believer in a permanent state of spiritual neediness and permanent engagement with the institutional apparatus that managed that neediness. The person who had fully and finally resolved their relationship to God, who felt no more need of clergy or sacrament or confession, was, in the framework of authorized theology, almost certainly deluded. Certainty about one's own salvation was itself a form of spiritual pride that required correction. The figure of the devil and the threat of diabolical influence added an additional layer to this psychological architecture. Not only was the believer's own nature disordered, but an external supernatural adversary was actively working to increase that disorder, to increase temptation, to plant doubt, to draw the soul away from authorized truth and toward spiritual destruction. This framing of doubt and questioning as potentially diabolical in origin was one of the most effective mechanisms for preempting intellectual examination of the tradition itself. When a believer began to feel doubts about authorized doctrine, the first interpretation the tradition offered was not, "You may be noticing something real." The first interpretation was, "This doubt may be a temptation of the enemy." The psychological effect was to transform the honest operation of a questioning mind into a spiritual danger signal, requiring not examination but resistance. The psychological rewards of belonging to the community of the faithful were genuine, and should not be minimized in any honest analysis. The sense of being loved by a divine being who knew you completely. The sense of belonging to a community that spanned centuries and continents. The sense of living within a meaningful story that gave your suffering purpose and your death significance. These were not trivial psychological benefits. They were, for many people, the most sustaining experiences of their lives. But they came with a cost. The psychological benefits of sacred belonging were available primarily to those who remained within the authorized boundaries of belief and practice. To question seriously, to doubt publicly, to depart from the community was to lose access to those benefits. The psychological cost of leaving was designed, whether intentionally or structurally, to be very high. Community, meaning, identity, and the hope of eternal destiny were all attached to continued membership. Walking away from the institution felt for many people like walking away from everything that made their life worth living. That psychological entanglement is not accidental. It is, in Spinoza's terms, exactly how the machinery was designed to function. What we have traced across this investigation is a transformation so complete that it becomes nearly invisible once you are standing inside it. A movement begins in poverty and occupied territory, among the marginalized and the forgotten. Its founder is executed as a political threat by a collaboration of religious and imperial power. Its earliest communities are voluntary, fluid, diverse, and often persecuted. And within 4 centuries, that movement has become the official religion of the largest empire in the Western world, complete with councils authorized to define truth, clergy with powers over eternal destiny, institutions with the capacity to excommunicate kings, and a theological vocabulary that makes obedience to existing authority a spiritual obligation. The transformation is not a mystery, it is a history. But the machinery through which it happened is, as Spinoza saw, systematically hidden from those who are most subject to it. Spinoza's analysis gives us the conceptual tools to see that machinery clearly. Religion organizes imagination, fear, and hope. Institutions capture that organization and make it serve their interests. Doctrine hardens around the needs of authority. Dissent is reframed as spiritual danger. The believer's own rational faculties are systematically devalued in favor of external interpretive authority. Sacred identity is made dependent on institutional compliance. The psychological costs of departure are structured to be overwhelming. None of this required a conspiracy. None of this required that every priest, bishop, theologian, or pope was a cynical manipulator. The machinery operates at a structural level that can be built and maintained entirely by people who genuinely believe they are serving a sacred cause. That is, in a sense, what makes it most powerful. The people inside the machine are also subject to it. The historical record we have examined is not the record of an aberration. It is the record of a predictable pattern in the relationship between spiritual authority and institutional power. That pattern did not appear only in Christianity. It has appeared wherever religious movements became powerful enough to attract the interest of political structures seeking ideological legitimacy. What makes the Christian case particularly significant for the history of the Western world is the extraordinary reach and duration of the institutional form Christianity took. The architecture of authority, guilt, obedience, and sacred belonging that was built between the 4th and 14th centuries shaped the psychological landscape of every Western society, including the secular and post-Christian ones that inherited its basic assumptions about authority, moral guilt, and the proper relationship between the individual and the institution. If you have followed this investigation this far, you understand something that many people who grew up inside religious traditions were never given the tools to see. You understand that a belief can be genuinely sacred to the person who holds it, and simultaneously be part of a structure that serves interests that have nothing to do with the genuine spiritual welfare of that person. These two things are not contradictory. They are in fact exactly what Spinoza would lead us to expect. The sacred and the political are not strangers. They have been intimate for as long as human beings have organized themselves around shared meaning. Seeing that intimacy clearly is not the end of spiritual life, it may be the beginning of a more honest one. This kind of investigation is what this channel exists to offer. If you are someone who has felt the need to examine what you inherited without being given the intellectual tools to do so, if you want to continue exploring the hidden machinery behind sacred beliefs with the same philosophical seriousness and historical honesty this investigation has tried to provide, then subscribing to the Heretic Lens is how you stay inside the archive. Every investigation on this channel follows the same principle. A belief may be sacred, but it is not beyond examination, and the examination is not the enemy of genuine spiritual life. It is, in the end, its only honest foundation. The questions we are examining here are not marginal academic puzzles. They are questions about the nature of authority, the origin of guilt, the architecture of obedience, and the possibility of thinking freely inside inherited structures of meaning. They are questions that matter to everyone who has ever felt the weight of a doctrine they did not choose, the guilt of a doubt they could not silence, or the loneliness of questioning something that everyone around them treated as sacred and settled. You are not wrong to feel those things. You are not alone in carrying them, and the archive is still open. The historical evidence for the relationship between institutional Christianity and political power is not speculative. It is documented in primary sources that the tradition itself preserved, often without recognizing their implications for the question Spinoza was asking. The Edict of Thessalonica, issued by the Emperor Theodosius in 380, did not merely establish Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. It specified which version of Christianity was official, requiring that all subjects of the empire hold the faith delivered by the Apostle Peter to the Romans, as professed by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria. Every other form of Christian practice was declared heretical and subject to legal punishment. This was not a theological event, it was a legal one. Imperial law defined Christian orthodoxy, not the other way around. The first legally enforced definition of Christian truth in Western history was written by an emperor, not by a council of theologians acting independently of political interest. The history of Christian heresy trials provides some of the clearest evidence for the political function of doctrinal enforcement. The charge of heresy from the early medieval period through the 16th century was not merely a theological category. It was a legal one with specific procedural and penal consequences. The Albigensian Crusade of the early 13th century, launched against the Cathar communities of southern France, was not simply a theological correction of erroneous belief. It was a military campaign that resulted in the destruction of entire communities, the displacement of populations, and the consolidation of political power over a previously semi-autonomous region. The crusade was authorized by papal decree and conducted with the cooperation of French royal power. The theological justification was real. The political and territorial consequences were equally real, and they benefited the French crown and the papacy simultaneously. The development of the Inquisition beginning in the 13th century represents perhaps the most documented institutional expression of the machinery Spinoza described. The Inquisition was a judicial institution with defined procedures, trained personnel, written records, and an explicit mandate to identify, question, and if necessary punish individuals whose beliefs deviated from authorized doctrine. The theological justification for this institution rested on the claim that heresy endangered the souls of the heretics themselves and of those they might influence. The structural function was to make unauthorized interpretation of doctrine a matter of institutional intervention rather than private conscience. The records of inquisitorial proceedings, many of which survive in European archives, provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of how religious authority was exercised in practice, how questions were framed to elicit confessions, how social relationships were used to identify suspects, and how the boundary between theological error and political threat was managed by the institution. The political theology of the medieval papacy developed most fully in the pontificate of Innocent III, and in the theoretical writings associated with his successors explicitly claimed that the spiritual authority of the papacy was superior to the temporal authority of secular rulers. The doctrine of the two swords, the spiritual sword wielded by the church and the temporal sword wielded by secular rulers, with the secular sword understood as subordinate to the spiritual in all matters touching on salvation, was not merely a theoretical claim. It was the basis for specific political interventions in which popes deposed rulers, invalidated political arrangements, imposed interdicts on entire kingdoms, and claimed the right to arbitrate between competing claimants to secular thrones. Whatever the theological arguments behind this doctrine, its political consequences were concrete and far-reaching. The claim that spiritual authority is superior to temporal authority is, in a society that takes eschatology seriously, a claim to ultimate political authority operating through theological categories. The role of Christianity in legitimizing European colonial expansion is one of the most extensively documented examples of the relationship between doctrine and political power in the modern period. The doctrine of discovery, elaborated in papal bulls of the 15th century, provided theological justification for the claim that Christian rulers could take possession of territories inhabited by non-Christian peoples. The conversion of indigenous populations was simultaneously a genuine theological mission and a mechanism of cultural transformation that served the interests of colonial powers by replacing indigenous frameworks of meaning, authority, and identity with frameworks organized around European ecclesiastical and secular hierarchy. The historical record of colonial mission, which includes extraordinary individual acts of witness and charity alongside systematic participation in structures of conquest and cultural destruction, illustrates precisely the kind of ambiguity that Spinoza's analysis illuminates. The sincere spiritual motivation and the political utility were not in conflict. They were deeply, structurally intertwined. The survival and reproduction of specific doctrines across centuries can itself serve as a form of evidence for their institutional utility. Doctrines that were not institutionally useful tended not to survive. The early centuries of Christianity were characterized by an extraordinary diversity of theological opinion, much of which was eventually declared heretical and suppressed. The specific doctrines that survived and became orthodox were, with consistency, the ones that supported the authority of the emerging episcopal hierarchy and that could be standardized into a form amenable to institutional enforcement. This does not prove that the surviving doctrines are false, but it raises a question that honest investigation cannot avoid. In the competition between theological positions that characterized the early centuries, were the winners selected primarily by the spiritual truth of their content, or partly by the institutional interests that found them most useful to maintain? Spinoza's framework predicts the latter. The historical evidence is, at a minimum, consistent with his prediction. The strongest defense of institutional Christianity is not an argument about the sincerity of individual believers, though sincerity matters. It is an argument about historical function, about what the institution actually did in the world across the centuries and about what would have existed in its absence. The great medievalist historians have made this case with considerable force. The Church of the medieval period was not merely a system of power and control. It was the primary institution through which a vast amount of positive social organization was conducted. The monasteries that preserved ancient texts through centuries of political instability. The hospitals that provided care to the sick in an era when no secular institution existed to do so. The schools and universities that were founded under ecclesiastical patronage and provided the educational infrastructure of European intellectual life. The networks of poor relief that functioned in the absence of any secular social welfare system. These were not trivial contributions to human welfare. They were the conditions of civilizational survival and development in a period of enormous political fragility. To examine the Church solely as an instrument of power is to ignore the massive institutional contribution it made to the conditions in which human life in Europe could be sustained and improved. The argument for the preservation of doctrine is similarly serious. The diversity of early Christianity was, from one perspective, a vibrant plurality of spiritual exploration. From another perspective, it was a condition of theological fragility, in which the core commitments of the tradition could easily have been lost, distorted, or absorbed into surrounding cultural frameworks beyond recognition. The councils that defined orthodox doctrine and the institutional apparatus that enforced those definitions can be understood as the mechanisms through which a complex of genuinely important spiritual insights survived the enormous historical pressures of political instability, cultural change, and philosophical challenge. The creed that was hammered out at Nicaea and refined at subsequent councils was not only an instrument of imperial control, it was also a carefully considered theological formula that tried to hold together a set of claims about the nature of Jesus that the tradition believed were essential to the integrity of Christian faith. Without some institutional mechanism for maintaining doctrinal coherence, Christianity might not have survived as a recognizable tradition at all. The psychological functions that the institution provided to ordinary believers should be treated as genuine goods rather than merely as mechanisms of control. The sense of meaning in suffering, the framework for understanding death, the community of mutual support and obligation, the moral formation that produced genuine acts of compassion and justice, the vocabulary for experiencing and expressing the deepest dimensions of human existence. These were real benefits that real people received from their participation in the tradition. The fact that the same institutional structure that provided these benefits also exercised forms of control does not cancel the benefits. Human institutions are rarely pure. They provide genuine goods and exercise real power simultaneously, and the mixture does not automatically reduce everything to manipulation. A mother who disciplines her child exercises power. A teacher who assigns required reading exercises authority. Power and genuine care for human welfare are not mutually exclusive, and to insist that they are is to adopt an analytical framework that distorts rather than clarifies. The reform movements that emerged from within Christian history can be cited as evidence that the tradition carried within it the resources for its own self-correction. The monastic reform movements, the Franciscan emphasis on apostolic poverty, the various pre-Reformation critiques of clerical corruption, the Protestant Reformation itself, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation that followed it. All of these were, at least in part, movements driven by the tradition's own internal standards, by an appeal to the founding story against the institutional reality. If Christianity were simply a machine of power with no genuine spiritual content, there would be no internal standard against which its institutional failures could be measured and condemned. The fact that the most powerful critiques of institutional Christianity in history were made by people who were themselves deeply formed by the tradition, who appealed to Jesus against the church, to Scripture against clerical corruption, to the example of the apostles against the wealth of the bishops, suggests that the tradition contained genuine spiritual resources that were not exhausted by their institutional capture. The historical alternatives to institutional Christianity in the periods we have examined are worth considering seriously. The political fragmentation of post-Roman Western Europe, the genuine social violence of the medieval period, the competing claims of different ethnic, linguistic, and political communities across an enormous and difficult territory. In this context, a universal institution with a shared moral language, a shared set of rituals, a shared network of administrative structures, and a shared conception of what it meant to live rightly in human community provided something that no secular alternative was in a position to provide. The argument is not that the Church's exercise of power was always just. The argument is that some institution with some claim to transcendent moral authority was almost certainly a condition of the social order that made European civilization possible in this period. And if some institution was going to exercise that authority, the one that at least claimed to be oriented toward the welfare of souls and the love of neighbor was not the worst possible candidate. The objection we have just considered is serious, historically informed, and deserves genuine respect. None of it, however, resolves the central problem that Spinoza's analysis identifies. The problem is not that the Church did some good things alongside the bad ones. The problem is that the mechanisms by which it maintained its authority, the suppression of doctrinal diversity, the enforcement of conformity through fear of damnation, the identification of independent thought with spiritual danger, the structural devaluation of the individual believer's own reason in favor of institutional interpretation. These mechanisms had consequences that cannot simply be balanced against the institutional goods, the individual who accepted authorized doctrine not because they had examined it and found it true, but because the consequences of not accepting it were too frightening to risk, was not a person who was genuinely benefiting from the tradition's spiritual resources. They were a person who was compelled. And the compulsion does not become acceptable because the institution also built hospitals. The argument that doctrinal enforcement was necessary to preserve the tradition's integrity across centuries is partially convincing and simultaneously illustrative of the core problem. The question that Spinoza's framework forces us to ask is not whether doctrinal coherence was necessary. It is whether the specific mechanisms used to achieve it, legal penalties, excommunication, inquisitorial trials, the burning of books and occasionally of people, were necessary in the sense of being unavoidable, or necessary in the sense of being effective instruments for protecting institutional authority. There is a significant difference between an institution that maintains doctrinal standards through persuasion, scholarship, and the example of its members' lives, and an institution that maintains them through the threat of social exclusion, legal punishment, and eternal damnation. The first kind of institution can claim that it is serving the truth. The second kind of institution has at minimum confused the service of truth with the maintenance of power. The reform movements that emerged from within the tradition are indeed evidence of genuine internal resources, but they are also evidence of something else. Every major reform movement in Christian history was at some point declared heretical by the institutional authorities it challenged. The Waldensians were condemned. The Hussites were suppressed by military force authorized by a church council. Martin Luther was excommunicated. The history of Christian reform is simultaneously the history of institutional resistance to reform, and the history of the institution eventually accommodating changes it could not prevent after the changes had been achieved by forces the institution could not control. The tradition's capacity for self-correction has historically been activated not by the institution voluntarily examining its own mechanisms of power, but by external pressure, political change, mass dissent, and the withdrawal of popular support. That pattern is not evidence of a healthy, self-correcting tradition. It is evidence of an institution that corrects itself primarily under compulsion. The sincere believer who holds doctrine out of genuine conviction, who would continue to hold it even if the institutional consequences of doubting it were removed, is not the subject of Spinoza's critique. The critique is directed at the system in which the sincere believer exists alongside the frightened one, and in which the institution has no particular incentive to distinguish between them. An institution that benefits from obedience, whether the obedience comes from genuine conviction or from fear, has a structural interest in not examining too closely the psychological origins of that obedience. The confession booth received the sincere and the terrified alike. The creed was required of the convinced and the compelled alike. The social penalties for departure fell on the questioner regardless of the quality or sincerity of their questioning. A tradition that claims to care primarily about the genuine spiritual welfare of its members would, if it took that claim seriously, invest heavily in ensuring that its members' faith was genuinely chosen rather than compelled. The historical record suggests that this was rarely the institution's primary concern. Spinoza's analysis remains relevant not because institutional Christianity still operates exactly as it did in the medieval period, but because the structural logic he identified continues to operate wherever religious authority claims the right to define truth and to impose costs on those who question it. The specific instruments have changed. Inquisitorial courts are no longer convened in Western societies. Burning at the stake for heresy is no longer a legal option. But the psychological mechanisms, the equation of doubt with spiritual danger, the equation of departure with eternal loss, the equation of questioning with betrayal of community and family, these continue to operate in contemporary religious communities with an effectiveness that their medieval predecessors would have recognized. The machinery evolves. The logic remains. Christianity looks different after this examination. Not worse in every dimension, but different in a way that cannot be unseen once it has been seen. It appears not only as a spiritual tradition with genuine resources of meaning, compassion, and wisdom, but as a structure that organized the psychological, social, intellectual, and political life of Western civilization for over 1,000 years through mechanisms that were rarely as purely spiritual as they claimed to be. The doctrine of salvation organized hope. The doctrine of sin organized guilt. The doctrine of hell organized fear. The doctrine of clerical authority organized dependence. The doctrine of apostolic succession organized institutional legitimacy. The doctrine of legitimate authority organized political obedience. Each of these doctrines had genuine theological depth and genuine spiritual significance for the people who inhabited them. Each of them also served institutional interests that were perfectly legible from outside the tradition's self-presentation. This dual reality is not a scandal that requires rejection of everything the tradition produced. It is a fact about the relationship between spiritual meaning and social power that applies to every major religious tradition in human history. Sacred meaning and institutional interest are not cleanly separable. They develop together, support each other, and sometimes corrupt each other. The question for the person who has inherited a religious tradition is not whether this mixture exists, because it does. The question is whether they are allowed to see it clearly. For most of the history of institutional Christianity, the answer provided to ordinary believers was no. The mechanisms that prevented clear seeing were precisely the mechanisms Spinoza identified: fear of spiritual consequences, devaluation of independent reason, equation of doubt with sin, and social costs for those who persisted in examining what they were told to accept. The historical Christianity that shaped Western civilization was also a civilization project in the broadest sense. The assumption that the cosmos was organized around a specific set of narratives, that human life had a specific origin and a specific destiny, that specific moral obligations followed from those narratives and that destiny, that specific institutions had the authority to mediate between the human and the divine. These were not merely religious assumptions. They were the organizing principles of an entire civilization's relationship to itself. The emergence of modern Western culture, including its secular dimensions, its scientific institutions, its political concepts of individual rights, its legal traditions, its philosophical frameworks, is incomprehensible without understanding the civilization that Christianity shaped, and the reactions against that civilization that modernity represents. You cannot understand Western secularism without understanding what it was seceding from. The psychological legacy of this history is visible in Western culture far beyond the boundaries of explicit religious practice. The experience of guilt as a fundamental moral response. The suspicion of pleasure as spiritually dangerous. The sense that the individual conscience is accountable to an authority higher than itself. The deep unease about death that drives enormous amounts of cultural production and philosophical reflection. These are not the exclusive property of people who attend church. They are the residue of a civilization shaped by a particular theological anthropology for over 1,000 years. Spinoza's analysis of how religious institutions shape the inner life of their populations was not merely a description of his 17th century. It was a description of something that was being built into the psychological infrastructure of Western civilization in a way that would persist long after the institutional power of the church began to decline. Seeing Christianity as a structure rather than only as a revelation does not require that you cease to find its texts beautiful, its ethical vision compelling, its rituals meaningful, or its community sustaining. It requires only that you see the structure clearly enough to evaluate, from outside it, what it asks of you and what it has historically done with the authority that asks you to give it. That seeing is not disloyalty to the tradition. It is the kind of honesty that the tradition's own best voices, from Augustine's confessions of his own complexity to Luther's refusal to recant at Worms to the liberation theologian's reading of the gospel from the perspective of the poor, have always claimed to value, even when the institution they operated within could not afford to let them practice it fully. This examination does not mean that every person who participated in or was formed by institutional Christianity was a victim of pure manipulation, and it does not mean that every institution or authority within the tradition was primarily motivated by self-interest. Human institutions are never that simple. The clerics who built the great libraries were genuinely committed to knowledge. The theologians who spent their lives developing precise accounts of the nature of grace were genuinely engaged with questions they believed mattered for human welfare. The abbesses who organized communities of women into institutions of learning, prayer, and service created something genuinely valuable for the people inside them. The missionaries who learned indigenous languages and preserved cultural knowledge alongside their theological work contributed something to human understanding that a purely cynical account of their project cannot accommodate. The tradition that produced these people and these works was not simply a machine. It was a civilization in the full complexity of that word. The critique of institutional power is not a critique of the individual believer who found genuine sustenance in the tradition. A person who prays and is comforted, who participates in the Eucharist and feels genuine connection to something beyond themselves, who reads the Beatitudes and is genuinely moved to act more justly and mercifully in their daily life. This person is not being examined by Spinoza's analysis in the sense of being exposed as deluded or complicit. The analysis is directed at the structure within which they exist, not at the genuineness of their experience. Genuine spiritual experience inside a compromised institution is entirely possible. It happens constantly. The history of Christian mysticism alone is enough to demonstrate that the mechanisms of institutional control were never fully successful at containing the depths of human spiritual experience within their authorized boundaries. Intellectual honesty about the relationship between Christianity and power does not require the adoption of a comprehensive atheism or a blanket contempt for religious life. Spinoza himself, despite being excommunicated and despite his devastating analysis of institutional religion, was not straightforwardly an atheist, and his philosophy included a serious account of the highest kind of human knowledge as something that could be called love of God, understood philosophically rather than institutionally. His critique of organized religion did not require him to abandon the search for genuine understanding of reality, including dimensions of reality that might be called spiritual. The target of his analysis was always institutional authority masquerading as revelation, not the genuine human impulse toward understanding the deepest features of existence. The families and communities for whom religious tradition provided the primary language of love, grief, celebration, and moral formation are not simply people who failed to think clearly. They are people who inhabited a cultural world in which the tradition was genuinely and pervasively present, in which its language shaped the most intimate experiences of human life from birth to death, and in which the alternative frameworks available were often less emotionally rich, less communally embedded, and less capable of addressing the experiences that religious traditions have always addressed most directly: suffering, mortality, moral failure, and the longing for meaning. The critique of institutional Christianity is not a claim that these people were fools. It is an invitation to see clearly what was given to them, how it was given to them, and at what cost. If Spinoza's analysis is correct and the historical record suggests it is at least substantially so, then what becomes possible for the person who has genuinely seen the machinery clearly? The first thing that becomes possible is a separation that the institution has always been very careful to prevent. The separation between the question of whether a doctrine is true and the question of whether it is institutionally enforced. For most of Western history, these two questions were structurally collapsed together. To be told something was Christian doctrine was simultaneously to be told it was true, to be told it was divinely revealed, to be told it was to be accepted without examination, and to be told that the examination itself was spiritually dangerous. The person who can genuinely separate these questions has regained something that institutional religion required them to surrender: the right to think. The recovery of independent reason in the domain of religion does not require that reason replace everything the tradition offered. Reason cannot tell you what to do with grief. Reason cannot fully account for the experience of beauty or the longing for transcendence. Reason cannot build a community by itself or sustain the difficult practices of forgiveness and mutual obligation that genuine human community requires. The critique of institutional authority does not reduce to the claim that reason is sufficient for everything that religion once provided. It reduces to the much more modest claim that reason is not prohibited, that the examination of inherited belief is not a form of spiritual suicide, that the person who thinks carefully about what they were taught is not more lost than the person who accepted it without examination. This modest claim was, in the historical context that produced Spinoza, radical enough to get a man excommunicated and a book banned across half of Europe. The spiritual life that becomes possible after genuine examination of institutional religion is not a life without depth or without serious engagement with the questions religion has always raised. It is a life in which those questions are approached with the full use of one's rational and historical faculties, without the prior requirement that the conclusions be consistent with what an institution needs them to be. The question of whether there is a God or a dimension of reality that deserves something like that name becomes genuinely open again rather than pre-answered by authority. The question of how to live well becomes genuinely ethical again rather than a matter of consulting an authorized list of obligations. The question of what death means becomes genuinely philosophical again rather than a choice between an authorized afterlife narrative and a void. These are harder questions when they are genuinely open, but they are more honest ones. The examination of inherited belief also makes possible a more honest relationship to what is genuinely valuable within the tradition. When you are no longer required to accept everything as a single revealed package, when you can distinguish between the founding story's genuine ethical vision and its institutional capture, between the textual tradition's genuine wisdom and its use as an instrument of authority, between the community's genuine care for its members and the mechanisms by which that care was made conditional on conformity, you can engage with what remains selectively, seriously, and freely. The Sermon on the Mount does not require the Inquisition to have been legitimate. The Psalms do not require the doctrine of papal infallibility to be historically credible. The experience of community and mutual obligation does not require the equation of doubt with sin. These can be disentangled carefully by a person who has the intellectual courage to do the disentangling. The freedom Spinoza was describing and the freedom that this investigation has been circling around from the beginning is not the freedom of a person who has decided that nothing is sacred. It is the freedom of a person who has decided that the sacred is not the exclusive property of institutions that claim to define it. The history of Christianity examined honestly through the lens Spinoza provides reveals a tradition that has always contained within it genuine spiritual insight alongside institutional capture of that insight. Seeing the capture clearly does not make the insight disappear. It makes it available for the first time without the price of surrendering the right to think. That is not a small thing. For the people who grew up inside inherited doctrines they were never invited to examine, who carried private doubts as if they were private sins, who felt the weight of guilt and fear without understanding where that weight came from, or who placed it there. The simple permission to think clearly is, in the most literal sense, a kind of liberation. And liberation, as every serious tradition has always known, is where genuine spiritual life begins. A movement began with preaching, hope, memory, and expectation. It moved through centuries and gathered into itself councils, creeds, courts, laws, hierarchies, armies, and empires. And somewhere inside that journey, the machinery came to be more important than the movement it was built to protect, because machinery always develops its own interests, its own momentum, its own will to survive and expand. The gears are visible now. They were always there. Spinoza saw them in the 17th century. The historical record preserved the evidence for anyone willing to look. What changes when you look is not that the hope and the memory and the expectation disappear. What changes is that you see them clearly at last for what they are. Human things, born in human communities, shaped by human needs and human power, capable of genuine beauty and genuine cruelty, deserving of honest examination precisely because they have mattered so much to so many people for so long. The question this investigation leaves open is one that historians, theologians, and philosophers have been debating for centuries, and it is a question worth asking openly here. Did Christianity become one of the most powerful forces in human history because its teachings were true? Because its institutions were useful to those who held power? Or because it learned over centuries how to make those two things look like the same thing? Leave your answer in the comments. There is no authorized response to that question, which is perhaps exactly the point.